And before I begin my portion of the talk today, I just want to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. This land is already under occupation, and I want to acknowledge the Ohlone people whose land this is. I am here today to tell you that I share your rage. I am here to tell you that I share your frustration. I'm here to tell you that I share your disgust in the government that places profits over people, corporate interests above humanity's interests, and exploitation over life. Today, I am here as an Indigenous woman to support your movement. And I am here to tell you, as an Indigenous woman, that the roots of your pain and mine are the same. It's my hope that you will use this opportunity to understand some deeper truths about the nature of the problems we are all up against. Since September 17th, Americans have taken to the streets to protest corporate greed, economic inequality, and to oppose what has become an increasingly fascist state. Occupy protesters around the country, and indeed around the globe, have labeled themselves as the 99%, in contrast to the wealthy elites who continue to build wealth on the backs of the masses. But the crises we are facing run much deeper than the economic inequality you are experiencing today. They reach back to the very foundations upon which this country was founded. They reach back to the imperial roots of conquest, rape, and plunder. As one protest sign proclaimed, the system isn't broken, it was built this way. Yeah. This movement began to protest Wall Street. It is no coincidence that this infamous street traces its origins to European colonial expansion. While many of you have probably learned by now that the 1653 palisade constructed along the northern perimeter of the wall of what was New Amsterdam was a defensive protection against Indigenous attack, what you may not know is that the war that prompted the building of the palisade was initiated by Dutch Governor William Kieft, who sought colonial expansion. Indigenous people stood in his way. On February 25th, 1643, when members of the DGR Confederacy fled to the Dutch for safety because they had paid taxes to the Dutch for protection by the soldiers, Kieft directed his men to attack Wappinger camps, killing 80 men, women, and children. The Dutch cut off the heads and took them back to New Amsterdam. In fact, one hefty Dutch woman was observed gleefully kicking the heads down the street. By 1644, the war had escalated and the Dutch had taken to publicly torturing Indigenous captives. In one torture of a Hackensack prisoner, the Dutch skinned him alive, strip by strip, forcing him to swallow his own flesh. Soldiers then drug him down the street. They threw him down and stuck his private parts, which they had cut off, into his mouth while he was still alive. And after that, they placed him on a millstone and beat his head off. I share this account not to traumatize anyone, but to illustrate the brutality that has always accompanied the colonial project. If you feel like you have been dispossessed, if you feel like you have been metaphorically skinned alive by an inhumane system, remember that it is Indigenous people who experienced that first on these lands. As historian Bob Venables described, Kieft's plans of conquest were not matched by the colony's capability for war. Thus, they needed the palisade to help protect their limited population. In another decade, in 1664, the English sailed to New Amsterdam and captured the Dutch colony, and one colonial force replaced another. I share this history to demonstrate that greed and desire for power have always characterized Wall Street. There is no separation between colonial expansion, the ongoing subjugation of Indigenous life, and the capitalist exploitation of life for economic gain. Further, these objectives have always been pursued with extreme brutality, and a callous disregard for any life that gets in the way. If you feel expendable, it's because to the current power structure, you are. All life is. In the conquest of the Americas, capitalism is inseparable from colonialism and imperialism. Like the relationship between the motherland and the colony, or civilization and its outlying communities, capitalism consists of a center, the heart of the system of capitalist exploitation, and the periphery, made up of dominated countries and peoples. As Samir Amir has stated, during all the stages of capitalism, the plunder of the resources of the peripheries, the oppression of colonized peoples, their direct or indirect exploitation by capital remain the common characteristics of the phenomenon of colonialism. Indigenous peoples were the first casualties of this inhumane system, but we certainly are not the last ones, nor are we the only ones. The crises we are in today are no surprise to Indigenous peoples. From the time of invasion, Indigenous people understood that the ways of the invaders were incompatible with life. They were incompatible with life not only because they launched relentless assaults on our people and homelands, but also because the exploitation required to fuel economic growth and expansion could not be sustained indefinitely. Indigenous people knew that Europeans and European Americans were heading in a suicidal direction, that someday even they would be forced to realize the lunacy of their actions. We are at that point today. Life before invasion and colonization was different for our peoples. As Lakota spiritual leader John Fire Lame Deer wrote, "Before our white brothers arrived to make us civilized men, we didn't have any kind of prison. Because of this, we had no delinquents. Without a prison, there can be no delinquents. We had no locks nor keys, and therefore, among us, there were no thieves. When someone was so poor that he couldn't afford a horse, a tent, or a blanket, he would, in that case, receive it all as a gift. We were too uncivilized to give great importance to private property. We didn't know any kind of money, and consequently, the value of a human being was not determined by his wealth. We had no written laws laid down, no lawyers, no politicians. Therefore, we were not able to cheat and swindle one another." And with his classic sense of humor, he wrote, "We were really in bad shape before the white men arrived." And I don't know how to explain how we were able to manage without these fundamental things that, so they tell us, are so necessary for a civilized society. If you know anything about Indigenous life today, you know that our health, well-being, and freedoms have deteriorated significantly since living under colonial occupation. We have seen all life deteriorate under colonial occupation. Within my homeland of Minnesota, Makoche, for example, since colonial occupation, we have witnessed the destruction of 90% of our wetlands, 98% of our big woods, and 99% of our prairies. At the current rate of destruction, we have the very real concern that life will no longer be sustained within any of our ecosystems. With European countries facing bankruptcy, we are witnessing the endgame of capitalism. The paradigm of unlimited growth is inherently unsustainable. It always has been. But this truth is finally catching up to American society. Given the realities of peak debt and peak oil, we're now facing the collapse of the American economy and the collapse of civilization more broadly. These, combined with the crises emerging from global warming, climate change, and the collapsing of ecosystems due to hyper-exploitation, mean that it is time for everyone to recognize the harm of the existing systems and institutions and to seek to dismantle them completely to save all life before it is all destroyed. You will not find your justice in capitalism. You will not find your justice in the colonial government of the United States. You will find justice when the institutions of capitalism and colonialism are destroyed and they are replaced by sustainable ways of being that nurture and protect all life. Put on the